Welcome to the Social Sciences Matrix at UC Berkeley. My name is Sam Trachtman, and I'm a senior researcher here at BESI, Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, where I run our research and programming on the political economy of California. On behalf of the BESI team, it's my great pleasure today to introduce Stephanie Ternullo, who's here visiting from Harvard. Before I do that, I'm going to say a few brief words about BESI and what we do here at BESI. So our core mission at BESI is to support and disseminate social science research that can help us to understand and address major contemporary societal challenges. Challenges like inequality, authoritarianism, climate change, technological disruption, and others. We do this primarily by holding events like this one, by supporting faculty and graduate students at Berkeley, by holding private convenings that bring together academics and policy practitioners, and by producing our own in-house research and policy papers. If you want to learn more about all of these activities, please check out our website or join our email list. We are grateful for you all for being here and for our co-sponsors for the event, the Citrin Center for Public Opinion Research, the Berkeley Center for American Democracy, Global Metropolitan Studies, and Students for Abundance at Berkeley. Most of all, we are grateful for Stephanie for coming out to Berkeley to share her fantastic research. Stephanie is an assistant professor of government at Harvard University and has a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. The talk she's presenting today is based on the research for her second book, which is currently in progress. Her first book, How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics, explores a crucially important phenomenon in American politics, the rightward turn of majority white post-industrial Midwestern cities. Contrary to much discourse in American politics, Ternullo's research shows that place still matters even in an era of highly nationalized, highly partisan politics. The research she will present today continues this theme, but in a very different context from Midwestern cities. The suburbs, liberal-leaning suburbs of dynamic coastal cities. As someone who's deeply involved in California housing politics, I can tell you that this research is extremely relevant to contemporary issues we're facing in our state. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Stephanie Ternullo.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you, Sam. That was such a nice way of describing my first book. Like several years after having written it, I still struggle to tell people what it's about, so I'm gonna copy and paste that the next time I have to explain it. Thank you all for being here today. I am really excited to share with you some of the findings from this new project that, as Sam said, is a book in progress. It's a really great time for me to be kind of putting this all together, sharing it with you all, hearing your questions, having conversation with you about it, because that's sort of the goal of the next couple of months is incorporating feedback, making revisions, and handing it in at the end of the summer. But I have a lot of time to do that, so I'm really excited to be here with you today. So the tentative title of the book is Suburban Blues, The Clash of Local and National Politics in America's Suburbs. Very open to ideas about a different title as well. But all right, I'm gonna start here with the observation that American political geography has undergone a real sea change in the last 70 years. What you're looking at here is a map of all of the counties that could be considered part of the sort of white working class New Deal coalition in the 1930s and 40s. So these are those sort of industrialized communities, unionized communities often, that sort of swelled into the ranks of the Democratic Party under FDR and really became kind of the foundation of the modern Democratic Party, right? The moment in time in American politics when scholars typically agree that we had a class politics like our European peers to the closest we're gonna get or ever have gotten so far. And this is a map of those same counties by 2016. And as you can see, the overwhelming majority of them, 96%, were voting reliably Republican, at least at the presidential level by then. And because of the sort of electoral importance of those kinds of communities, often in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there's been a lot of scholarly attention trying to understand why those places went from blue to red, including by me, which is really presumptuous because these are much better known titles. But I think these are really important questions. This is all to say, I think these are important questions. I have also tried to answer them. And one of the sort of core explanations for this change in political geography is a shift in economic geography. And so in my first book, I argue that this is an important explanation, but a partial explanation. Nevertheless, it's important. So what am I talking about here? What you're looking at here is a figure that plots commuting zone density on the x-axis against the share of working age adults with a college degree on the y-axis, and every curve is a different decade in the census data. So basically what you're seeing with this flat line down here is that in the 1950s, there wasn't a lot of relationship between density and college education rates. By the 1980s and really accelerating to the 90s and 2000s, there became a much more positive relationship between density and college education rates. And scholars really attribute this to the shift from an industrial to a post-industrial knowledge economy, which led to what people have called a rural brain drain, as high schoolers from rural communities who went on to college tended to leave and go to those sort of denser, more urban areas that were benefiting from this economic transition, creating this kind of new inequality between cities and exurban or rural areas. And this is one core explanation, as I said, for this kind of growing urban-rural polarization. And we can see that urban-rural polarization here. So this figure is plotting county-level Democratic presidential vote share from 1932 to 2020. And you can see urban counties here in blue, rural counties in red, and then suburban counties here in purple. And so what I want to emphasize here is that despite the fact that this sort of shifting economic geography is understood to be an explanation for all of this change, right? The turn to the left and the turn to the right, the overwhelming body of scholarship has really been on these communities that have turned to the right. And as I said, these are an important set of places to study. I have studied them. I continue to think they're important. But I think that scholars should also be paying attention to what's gone on over here with the communities that have turned to the left. And I particularly think we need to be paying attention to suburbs because although their transition has been more recent and not as sort of intense as what's gone on in cities, they pose a set of really interesting puzzles for us as social scientists. And that's because despite the sort of emergent changes in the national level politics of America's suburbs, there's been a lot of stasis at the local level. What do I mean by that? So we have this sort of very clear history of the emergence of the suburbs in the era of what historians have called mass suburbanization following World War II, when a combination of federal and local policies made white homeownership in the suburbs financially feasible for the first time, right? And there's this clear evidence that this helped create spatial inequalities between the suburbs and the cities that has really endured in a lot of ways through today. And once suburbanites were ensconced in the suburbs, we know that they used local control over land use and public education to ensure that they kind of retained that concentrated advantage in their communities. The flip side of that was exacerbating concentrated disadvantage in urban communities of color. And when I say there's been local political stasis, I mean that those local policies are largely still in place in America's suburbs today. So for example, when it comes to land use, suburbs still have the most restrictive land use policies of any kind of place in the country, which means that it's more difficult to build more and denser housing in those communities than it is in cities or in non-metro areas. And we can see that here using data from the Wharton Residential Land Use Regulation Index, which is a survey of municipal leaders across the country. And higher values here indicate that it's more difficult to develop in those communities. So basically, suburbs have much more restrictive land use regimes than either cities and non-metro areas. And also just briefly to note, this isn't purely a density story, although I think density has something to do with it. But non-metro communities are the places where it's easiest to develop. And I can tell you from the research from my first book that this makes sense, right? Non-metro communities that have sort of been on the disadvantaged side of that transition to the knowledge economy, they would welcome any and all kind of development. Suburbs don't want anything, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, and then the same is true for education. Suburbs are still sort of funneling more revenue per student than cities within the same metro areas, and this is allowing them to have policies like lower student-to-teacher ratios, which have been shown to improve student outcomes. And so because of these policies, low-density housing and quote-unquote excellent public education continue to define what are referred to as the suburban way of life, right? The very policies that made America suburbs in the post-war era are still intact. The policies that gave us this image of the suburban way of life are still intact, and people who are living in those kinds of suburbs today are still experiencing their communities as defined by low-density housing and excellent education. But as the suburbs have become more democratic, as we've seen, this means that any reforms that are challenging those local policies in the name of redistribution create a potential for tension between suburban Democrats' self-interest and their political commitments. And so I think this, as I said, raises some really important questions for us as social scientists. First, just descriptively, to what extent are suburban Democrats today still fighting for the same local policies that their counterparts put in place 70 years ago? Second, what explains their behavior in local politics? In other words, how are suburban Democrats forming opinions about local housing and education policies that have the potential for this tension, right? Policies that could upend the suburban status quo in the name of redistribution. And finally, what could change that behavior? What could convince suburban Democrats to support local politics that are perhaps more in line with their national political commitments towards social liberalism and redistributive politics more generally? So 3 questions. I'll give 3 answers in the book. Today I won't give you them all. I'll give you part of one. But in the first part of the book, I argue that local national divergence characterizes suburban Democrats' behavior on housing and education policies. What I mean by this is that they still continue to behave in exclusionary ways on these local policies, despite the fact that both their voting behavior and their opinions and survey data suggest that they have really turned to the left in national politics. And so I call this local national divergence. In part 2, I argue that this divergence persists despite what scholars have described, as Sam said earlier, the quote-unquote nationalization of American politics, because local processes still ensure that residents remain both deeply invested in the suburban status quo and unaware that their efforts to preserve it may be at odds with their national political commitments. The result is that they are still very easily mobilized to protect that status quo, and they end up reproducing those same suburban characteristics that attracted them in the first place. And finally, in part 3, I argue that local political mobilizations can change this dynamic by changing the information environment, conveying the ideological stakes of these issues, and redefining the boundaries of socially acceptable local politics. So here's a place where if anything stands out in what I tell you over the next couple minutes and you think this would be an interesting contribution to highlight, I would love to hear your thoughts. But I think that there are potentially 4 contributions here. The first, I think, at this kind of most basic level, and maybe the most important level, is that a lot of what I'm doing here in this book is in-depth case studies, as you'll see, from 4 affluent democratic suburbs. And I think that this kind of qualitative approach can really tell us something new about how voters are drawing on different kinds of information to form opinions on local issues. We know in political science that there's often a sort of lack of information in local politics, and increasingly so given the decline of local news. We have some evidence and theories of some of the consequences of that decline in local news for local political behavior, but we don't really have any kind of on-the-ground insight into the black box of how voters are making sense of issues at all in the absence of local news or national media attention. And I think that this project just provides some of that basic description. Second, I think through this sort of descriptive exercise, I think we can learn something new about when and how we should expect nationalization to occur. And here, I'm taking the definition from political scientist Dan Hopkins, or one component of his definition, which is the idea that the sort of ways we're divided in national politics filter down to how we're divided in local politics. So typically we think of that as partisanship or ideology, right? So the idea is like, if you're a Democrat who votes for Democrats, up the ballot, you're also going to vote for Democrats down the ballot. You're going to behave like a Democrat no matter what sort of context we put you in. And what I'm showing in this book is that is actually really, that outcome of increasingly polarized and partisan local politics is contingent on the local information environment, that we need that information environment to be providing that kind of partisan and ideological information. Otherwise, people are going to draw on different local cues to form their opinions. And I also show in part 3 that perhaps counterintuitively, it's actually local social movements that can often provide that sort of polarizing information. Next, I think, I don't know if this is a social science contribution, but I think of this as maybe like a subtle political goal of the book, which is that me and several other people have written a lot of books and research about the sort of conflict amongst the working class, particularly the white working class. Why do they vote Republican if it's against their self-interest? But as I've already shown you, that sort of inversion in both class politics and political geography is an inversion, and also kind of has implications for people on the other side of that transformation, which is affluent people who vote for the Democratic Party. And so if we're not going to ask questions about them the same way we ask questions about working class voters, we should stop asking questions about working class voters, or we should start asking questions about the affluent voters. So here I am doing that. And I think that in doing that, I'm hoping to shed some new light about like how self-interest operates according to voters' own subjective understanding of what their interest actually is. And then finally, I think that this will shed some new insights into the contemporary political processes that sustain spatial inequalities between suburbs and cities. This is mostly what I'm going to talk about in today's talk. But very briefly, my goal here is to basically kind of fill in this gap. You know, we know why suburbs and cities became the way they became in the post-war era, as I've already described. There was this sort of particular demographic process, white flight, that was enabled by these federal and local policies, right? But since the 1990s, that demographic process has been reversed from the return to the city. This is what has led to gentrification. So we know that kind of that migration pattern is not probably what's still sustaining spatial inequalities. But I'm going to show you today, I think it's actually a related but slightly distinct and perhaps more subtly race and class migration process that's sustaining these inequalities. Okay, so how am I going to make these contributions? The book takes a mixed methods approach, which involves leaning into the comparative advantages of different methods. And what I mean by that is that when I show you qualitative evidence, I'm going to be focused on what qualitative evidence does well, which is, some folks might call it going deeper. I'm going to call it looking into the nitty-gritty of what people say and how they think to understand how they make meaning of their social and political world and to draw out processes and mechanisms, right? When I go to the quantitative data, we're going to try to assess the generalizability of the findings from the qualitative evidence or really identify causal effects. So you might be looking at a quote and thinking, is that generalizable? And then I'll try to convince you it is later, but I'm not going to try to do that with that quote, right? That's not the comparative advantage of any one interview. Okay, so most of the qualitative evidence in the book, as I already mentioned briefly, comes from 4 cases of affluent Democratic suburbs. So how did I choose those cases? And I was saying to Sam earlier, it's, you know, you all are a great audience for this because there's 2 Bay Area cases and 2 Boston suburban cases. Anybody have Boston connections? Yeah, okay. This is fairly typical to have some Boston, Bay Area dual connections. So you're a good audience for this. Okay, so this is the same figure I showed you earlier. You're still looking at Democratic presidential vote share over time. You still have cities in blue. You still have non-metro counties in red. And now you have in purple something I'm calling knowledge economy suburbs. All other suburbs are here in orange, okay? So those knowledge economy suburbs are the suburbs that have seen a real influx of working age adults, an increase in college education and median incomes. They are the communities that we can think of as benefiting most from that transition to the post-industrial to knowledge economy in the 1970s and 80s, right? And those are also the communities, the suburbs that have turned the most to the left, right? And so they're the places where we should actually expect this potential for tension between local and national politics to be the highest. They're some of the most advantaged communities in the country, and they're also some of the most democratic communities in the country. And so within those knowledge economy suburbs, I have 4 cases, 2 in the Bay Area, Belmont and Menlo Park, and 2 in the Boston metro area, Brookline and Newton. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the historiography on the emergence of the knowledge economy, scholars have argued that actually Silicon Valley and Route 128, which is the ring road around Boston, those are actually like the archetypes of the emergence of the knowledge economy in the US within geographic space. And so when we think about kind of places that are really similar in the country, these 4 communities, as far as places go, are very, very similar. You can see that they are extremely affluent, with median incomes between 130 and 198,000, median home values in Belmont and Menlo Park over 2 million, and they are much more affluent and highly educated than your sort of average American suburb, which is over here. But like the average American suburb, they are more advantaged economically than the average place in America. So these are particularly advantaged suburbs. You'll also note that they're more racially heterogeneous than your average suburb. They're less white and more Asian than your average American suburb. So all this is to say, there's so much more we could talk about with these cases, but when we think about this argument, we want to think about how we can actually generalize theoretically from these 4 very pointy cases that are very democratic and very advantaged, where this potential for tension between self-interest and political commitments is potentially very high, right? That can be really helpful for a researcher because it's going to make those processes really more easily observable for me as a researcher, but it also means we shouldn't expect the dynamics I'm talking about here to necessarily play out in suburbs. Some demographers have called them first suburbs, so suburbs of declining industrial cities in the Midwest, like Cleveland suburbs probably aren't going to be the cases where we should expect these arguments to apply. Okay, so very briefly, I interviewed 132 residents across the 4 cities over these 2 years. I ended up doing 2 rounds of in-depth interviews with folks in Belmont, Menlo Park, and Newton for reasons I'm happy to describe. I also interviewed community leaders, and then in the book I have a counterfactual case, which is an affluent Republican suburb, Yorba Linda in California, which comes up in chapter 6. And when I was there, living there for a month, I thought it would come up a lot more than in chapter 6, but it comes up only in chapter 6 in the book. So that's the qualitative evidence. And there's a lot to say about what I do in the interviews. I just want to tell you 2 things right now, but I'm happy to answer questions about this. So first, I'm going to focus on 2 policies. 1 housing policy and 1 education policy, both of which have this, as I said, potential for redistribution that could threaten the suburban status quo. So on housing, I'm talking about the liberalization of zoning. Sometimes I call it upzoning or densification. This is probably familiar to everyone in this room. Policies that make it easier to build more and perhaps denser housing. This, of course, threatens what I've told you is a suburban way of life because it threatens low-density housing, but it has this redistributive potential in that we know that more liberalized zoning regimes can make housing more affordable. On education, I focused my interviews on a policy called de-leveling, which is less familiar to everyone, myself included. But this is when a school district removes kind of separate courses for honors and advanced, geography, and instead everyone is in the same classroom. It often happens in 8th, 9th, maybe 10th grade. And this also has a redistributive aim, which is to kind of reduce tracking within high schools and reduce ethno-racial equality within schools, and it also threatens the sort of excellent public education dimension of suburban way of life. And I keep saying excellent in quotes because this is really my suburban interviewee sort of subjective understanding of what is an excellent public education. And for them, it really has to do with meritocracy and individualism. And so de-leveling is a real threat. So those are 2 policies that I talked about in the interviews, and then I'll talk about today. The only other thing I just want to draw your attention to is that I'm going to talk to you about why people made the residential decisions that they made, why they moved where they moved. And this is a sort of really tricky task for all social scientists, as we know, because people don't really know why they behave the way they behave. And so if you ask them, they'll often give you a kind of like ritualized narrative. Like if you ask me, why did I marry my husband? I could give you like our love story. Is that why I married my husband? We don't know. The other tricky thing here is that I'm asking people about residential decisions they often made years in the past, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so they often forget. So in the interviews, I did a couple of things to try to deal with these challenges. The first, for the sort of memory piece, is that I tried to lead people down the cognitive pathway to the time and place in their lives when they made that decision, right? What was going on in your life when you and your wife moved to Newton? Oh, we just had 2 kids. Okay, and then what did you do next? And then they'll tell me a little bit more about their search process. And then as they tell me about their search process, I try to draw out their implicit preferences. So I would ask them to compare, Menlo Park to Palo Alto, or Los Gatos, but in California you call it something weird, not Los Gatos. Do you call it Los Gatos? Okay, Los Gatos, okay. Yeah, okay. So, but I would ask them to compare to neighboring communities, why this one, not the other. And people would sort of, through that process, reveal, in Redwood City, the school district isn't as good. And so, of course, we chose Belmont over Redwood City. And that told me something about their preferences for where they lived that perhaps they wouldn't have revealed when I just asked them, why did you move to Belmont? Because oftentimes it's so taken for granted that they were moving to where they moved because of the school district that they didn't even mention it. Okay, so next, the other piece of evidence I'm going to show you today is one of the quantitative data sets that I assembled for the project, which is a survey of a little over 7,500 respondents in the 20 largest metro areas in the country. So it's all urbanites and suburbanites. And I'm going to use these data to try to assess some of the generalizability of the claims that I'll make from the qualitative evidence. Okay, so that's a lot. I'm going to now show you some of that evidence, which I hope is the fun part. Okay, so today I'm going to ask 2 questions, which falls into kind of part 2 of the book. I'm going to ask what sustains the local national divergence in suburban Democrats' behavior on housing and education policies. And more generally, I'm going to try to understand how suburban Democrats are forming opinions about local housing and education policies that have this potential to upend the suburban way of life in the name of redistribution. And I'm going to argue, as I mentioned before, that local processes ensure that residents remain both deeply invested in the certain status quo and relatively unaware that their efforts to preserve it may be at odds with their national political commitments. I'm going to show you that people move to the suburbs precisely because of their housing and education preferences. Then they come to value those preferences more over time, which means that suburbs contain the very people who are most opposed to housing and education reform, regardless of their partisanship and often their other characteristics. And then I'm going to show you that the local information environment actually protects them from feeling that cross pressure we may otherwise expect. It's said several times that these issues, these redistributive local issues, create the potential for tension. And what I actually observe in my interviews is that people don't feel that tension unless there is a local political mobilization forcing them to confront it, because they're relatively unaware that their stance on housing and education policies might be at odds with some of their national commitments, political commitments. And then finally in the book, I show that this means that suburbanites continue to mobilize to preserve the status quo, creating a self-reinforcing process that is often difficult to disrupt from within, which means that state housing policies that kind of disrupt this internal cycle can be, I think, a really important way of overcoming these enduring spatial inequalities. All right, so the first part of this argument is about people moving to suburbs because of housing and education preferences and then coming to value them more over time, meaning that they oppose changes to housing and education reforms regardless of their partisanship. So that's that local national divergence, right? They're not acting like Democrats, they're acting like suburbanites. And a big part of the reason for this is residential sorting. So as social scientists, we typically think of residential sorting as like a source of bias, right? We can't precisely estimate the effect of place over behavior because different kinds of people live in different places for different reasons that we can't always observe. But sociologist Rob Sampson has for several years now been trying to convince us that actually that residential sorting component is a key piece of the causal process sustaining spatial inequalities that we should be paying more attention to. And taking this very seriously, sociologists Kreisen and Crowder have argued that we should really think about residential sorting in the 21st century as something called structured sorting, right? Where people's sort of social position, their race, class, gender informs their preferences for where they want to live after economic constraints are taken into consideration. And that determines their search radius in the first stage of their search. And that's really important because it means that certain kinds of people are only going to consider certain kinds of places, and they're going to completely rule out other ones, right? And what I argue in the book is that suburbanites' first set of search criteria have to do with housing and education policy preferences. And we can see that here in this conversation I have with Asher. Asher is a father from Newton, Massachusetts, a homeowner. And I was asking him, as I described to you, kind of what was going on in his life when he and his wife decided to move to Newton. He explained they were living in this condo in downtown Boston. They had their second baby. Their first kid was 3 years old. They wanted more space. They were concerned about entering public schools soon. He goes on to say, quote, "We were targeting the suburban lifestyle, the house with the yard, the kids in the neighborhood, proximity to my family." I probed him, well, there's a couple other suburbs in the area, maybe like a Needham, a Belmont. These are two neighboring suburbs, very similar proximity to the city, very similar education systems, very affluent. And I said, did you consider any other places besides Newton? He said, Newton was the front runner based on where my family are and proximity to the city for commuting purposes, based on the school system. We did look at some places in Wellesley, Weston, I think, Needham. We didn't really go to Belmont. I think of that as a touch more urban than what we were looking for. In the end, Weston was too rural for my wife's taste. Newton was urban enough that you could see your neighbors out the window. There's a lot of restaurants and sort of stuff to see and do, but it's also, you can get a quarter acre with a yard and put up your swing set, and your kids can play outside and stuff like that. And so you can see how preferences over school quality and density completely circumscribed their search process, right? So after economic constraints, which is commuting distance to the city, they were concerned about the school system, and they were concerned about the right mix of density. Now, we might be concerned here, Asher is a white man, that when he's talking about Belmont being too urban, Weston being too rural, that he's actually talking about preferences, about racial characteristics. Given everything I've already told you about white flight, shaping America's suburbs, maybe he's talking about wanting to live in a particularly white community. What I'll know is that Belmont, which he calls too urban, is actually almost demographically identical to Newton. As I said, these are some of the most exclusive and kind of Tony suburbs in the Boston area. What he's really talking about, as he goes on to say, is density. It was urban enough that you could see your neighbors out the window. The urban amenities, there's a lot of restaurants and sort of stuff to see and do, but you can also get a quarter acre with a yard. So for him and his wife, they wanted to live in a community defined by a particular kind of housing density and a particular kind of school system. And what this means, although I think this is kind of, maybe one of the most banal observations you can make about why parents move to certain communities, what this means is actually really politically important, because it means that suburbs are continuing to attract exactly the kinds of people who love the policies that protect low density housing and good, quote unquote, good public schools, right? They're drawing those people in for those reasons. And then once those people come to live in those communities, they develop a further appreciation for the status quo. And I could observe this most clearly in conversations I had with people who didn't quite really choose their communities for the specifics of that place, right? And this was actually really typical because if you think about the way the search process works, you sort of circumscribe the set of communities you're interested in living in. This could lead you to several different suburbs that are near to the city that have similar housing density and similarly good public school systems. And then from there, my interviews often described kind of ending up in one town rather than the other, only because of the house that was available at the time. They lost out in this bidding war and they ended up in this one, and then 10 years later, they've been a Belmont resident for 10 years, like Rakesh here. As he explains, they moved to Belmont really because that was the place where we could think of sending our kids to a public school. It was just really about the schools. But over time, once we started living in Belmont, we found out all other places which we thought, okay, They're good for hiking, going for walks, meeting some new friends, meeting new friends. That became the nice thing. Then we started liking it more. Now I don't want to live anywhere else but here. In particular, in addition to the walks and meeting new friends, the PTA was really important for Rakesh and his wife and sort of feeling like they had a community in Belmont. So what this means is that suburbs are attracting these people who really value the housing and education status quo. And then folks, as they get embedded in their communities, are coming to sort of appreciate the status quo more and more over time. And it means that suburbs today, regardless of their changing partisan composition, are still full of people who view education and housing reforms as a threat to the suburban way of life that they are deeply, deeply invested in. And you can see this in this conversation I had with Henry when I talked to him about a state-level Massachusetts housing reform that's requiring his town, Newton, to liberalize zoning in certain areas and increase density. He explains he doesn't like this plan to increase density because, quote, we live in the suburbs and we don't want it to be turned into Boston. So for him, densification is a threat to what makes his suburb suburban. He doesn't want it to be turned into Boston. So to what extent does this argument generalize to other suburbs? I show in the book that suburbanites do have sort of clearly systematically different residential, this is really hard to see on a slide, but different residential preferences than urbanites. In particular, urbanites prefer high density housing and walkability. They also have different preferences over school districts. But many people don't get to live exactly where they would like to live. And yet, as they spend more time in their communities and build more ties, they become more attached, just like we saw with Rakesh. And then that place attachment is correlated with support for the status quo. So what I want to underscore here is that these processes, this sort of residential sorting based on local characteristics, local place characteristics, and the cultivation of place attachment, engendering support for the status quo, those are sort of generalizable processes, place-based processes that we should expect to happen across all different kinds of geographies, right? People move to a place because they like the place characteristics. They live there longer. They value those place characteristics even more. They're more likely to defend the status quo of their community that protects those place characteristics. But when we put that sort of those place-based processes into a metro area in the context of local control over housing and education policies, and we have people sorting precisely because of housing and education policies, it creates spatial inequality because it allows suburbanites to continue sustaining the policies that put up barriers between suburbs and cities. And then they go on to oppose reforms to status quo, and this is just showing you that. But I'm going to skip past that to very briefly tell you the second reason for the perpetuation of this local national divergence. So what I've tried to show you so far is that because of these place-based processes, residential sorting, and the cultivation of attachment to the status quo, suburbanites remain really deeply invested in what their communities are and wanting to protect them, regardless of partisanship. But then there's this other piece to it, right? Why is partisanship not entering the picture? Why are they still thinking like suburbanites, thinking about what's best for their communities and not thinking about their sort of liberal political commitments? And I argue that one reason is because of a local information environment, which actually protects them from feeling that cross pressure that we might otherwise expect. On the one hand, this is because it lacks the partisan and ideological cues we typically expect people to have on national issues, right? They don't know necessarily that liberalizing zoning, reducing neighborhood control over development proposals, that these are quote unquote liberal issues. They're not necessarily coded that way, or democratic issues. But at the same time, in the absence of these national ideological and partisan cues, what they do have are local cues about how their friends and neighbors are responding to these issues. And when they look around them, they see other people like them, their friends and neighbors, their peers, behaving in self-interested ways. And so they think, okay, that's what people like me do. And so they don't feel the cross pressure we would otherwise expect. So very briefly, this is just some evidence of that absence of partisan cues, right? So this is from the survey. And I asked people, over a range of policies, which party they thought was more likely to support those policies. The Republicans, Democrats, both equally likely, neither is likely to support, or not sure, right? And so what you can see here is that when it comes to policies like expanding abortion access, supporting affirmative action, and redistribution generally, people have a very good sense that those are policies that Democrats love. Like, Americans know that Democrats support abortion access. They also know that Republicans support gun access. These are clearly partisan coded policies. But when it comes to the policies that I'm interested in this book, for example, incentivizing zoning reform or de-leveling the school curriculum, between 25 and 50% of respondents know that those are coded as Democratic policies. There's a lot of reasons for this, because the parties at the national level aren't making these central to their coalitions. So local politics scholars would kind of expect this outcome. But it's really important for us to set that sort of baseline empirical fact that these aren't clearly coded partisan policies for metro area residents. So how do they make sense of these policies? So if they're not Democratic and Republican, what are these policies? And what my interviewees told me is that these local debates, they're not partisan, but what they're about is people protecting their own self-interest. When it comes to housing, they expect their friends and neighbors are trying to defend their own neighborhoods. When it comes to education, they expect their friends and neighbors are doing what's best for their children. And we can see that here in this conversation I have with Finn, who's another father from Newton. And I'm asking him, if he were in a room and there was a sort of public meeting about this de-leveling policy, which I've just described to him, and some people opposed it and some people supported it, what did he think would be dividing those people? He said, from my experience, I find that, it's kind of like the NIMBYism thing. It doesn't matter your party affiliation. Sometimes people just want to protect their kids' advancement above all else. And I don't care about the greater good. It's just, I want what's good for my kid now. I think there's a lot of that in every area, especially in areas with higher income like Newton, where it's I moved to this area to get the best and my kid deserves the best and I don't care about anything else. That's not Finn's own opinion. What he's saying is that what he observes and expects from his neighbors in Newton, other people like him, is that they will act against de-leveling, against this redistributive measure, because that's what's best for their kids, right? And so what this means is the combination of this absence of national cues and the presence of local cues about self-interested behavior is that when Democratic suburbanites behave in self-interested ways, they aren't feeling any cross-pressure to change their behavior. Okay, so back to the questions that I said I was going to answer today. I wanted to tell you what sustains the local national divergence in suburban Democrats' behavior on housing and education policies, and more generally, how are suburban Democrats forming opinions on these issues that have the potential to create this tension. And I've argued that they are continuing to act in line with their self-interest rather than political commitments, because first, that self-interest is not just about their financial well-being. It's really about preserving the suburban way of life, which, as I've shown you, they continue to be very invested in because they've moved to a community for the housing and education characteristics. They've come to value them more over time. These are really salient and really important pieces of what they value about their lives. And second, I've shown you that the local information environment protects them from feeling cross-pressured by their national political commitments to embrace change. In the context of the book, as I said, these pieces of evidence are parts of the second part of the book. And then in part 3, I examine how local political mobilization can kind of change that local information environment and introduce some of the sort of nationalizing information that I argue is typically absent from these contexts, and whether that can change the status quo. And again, in the context of the book, I think that these findings make a couple of contributions. They're showing us, as I said earlier, about how voters are drawing on different kinds of information. They don't have these national partisan cues. Instead, they're looking to their friends and neighbors to understand other kinds of cues about how people are thinking about these issues. And they also tell us something about how we should expect nationalization to occur. Again, people can't necessarily behave like partisans if they don't know how to behave like partisans, right? And this is something that I think is really common sense in the political science literature. But I think in this part of the book, I'm able to sort of show what that looks like on the ground. Okay, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, so I went to a meeting of the Berkeley Democrats a number of years ago.
Okay.
And there was a fairly well-known housing advocate, homeless expert or whatever from San Francisco, came and spoke. And he started out his conversation, said, your politics are not in concert with, I mean, was it just exactly this issue? Are your politics are not in concert with your values?
Yeah.
Here, I mean, you guys, you're very, very contented in your situation and so on, but you're blocking all sorts of housing. But how about your politics? Your politics would indicate that you care about people being homeless and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what's surprising about that, because who wants to make a sacrifice, right? If you have, ultimately, as you said, your kids are the ones that, if you want things to be equitable, then you have to be willing to give up your kids, say, going to an Ivy League school. And if you're willing to do that, then you're serious. But if not, then it's much harder, right? And so I guess I'm not sure what's partly my confusion is I'm not sure what's surprising about this. Even if there are people are isolated from national cues, my bet is that this would have been true. When I was growing up, there were lots of local newspapers, but it was still the same thing. My house is where I get value, so I don't want to have more building in that area because it will reduce the value of my home.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point. A couple of things. So first, I think when I talk about self-interest here, I'm trying to reframe. I think there's a lot of debate and empirical kind of back and forth on the extent to which local political behavior is guided by self-interest or by other concerns, often racial concerns, and sometimes partisan concerns. The sort of basic expectation of the literature is exactly as you're saying, which is that basically every local policy is capitalized on our home values, and so we're going to behave in local politics in the way that is most geared towards protecting our home values. So one thing I'm trying to show you here is that some of this behavior isn't just motivated by property values at all, actually. That a lot of the people that I've interviewed will tell me things like, talking to a Bay Area audience, like, they've made $1.5 million on their home in the past 40 years, and so they don't care if they lose $500,000. That's not why they don't like development. What they care about is like losing the community feeling and this like really deep attachment to place. And it's a different way of conceptualizing self-interest than what the literature typically uses. But I agree in some ways it's really not surprising.
I guess I'd say you can't separate the two. In other words, that they don't want to change the community or whatever, but that's part of, they don't think about it in terms of the value of their home, but that's part of it. The value of their community or the value of their neighborhood. That I'm not sure how you separate that as though it's not. It's the same thing in a certain sense, is what I believe.
Definitely, those two things are definitely very related. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. That's very interesting. But I would like to ask if you, there's an anecdote. I think this is part of my question. So we talk about the Democrats who are in these suburbs, but what I noticed from my parents' experience and the people I know is that there are a lot of Chinese immigrants in these suburbs. They're part of the Asians, but they're very Republican. They support the same housing policies or education policies as their white counterpart, and they even behave in the same way, same hobbies, but on national politics, they're more Republican. This is true in suburbs in California, true in places like Brookline, and I wonder if, for immigrants who are moving into these spaces, there is more of a alignment, awareness of what's going on between national politics and like local politics. It seems like, that's a curious thing I've seen.
I guess what I would say is I did interview several immigrants from several different sending contexts, and I wouldn't say that they're more aware of like national party stances on these issues. One reason for that figure I showed you is that the national parties aren't taking stances on these issues, right? And I guess to kind of go back to your question, like part of the debate in the literature right now is like the classic scholarship has said in local politics, everyone is self-interested. Exactly, we shouldn't be surprised by that. But this new scholarship is saying, well, no, actually, partisanship has become so key to our identities that we're behaving like Democrats and Republicans in all contexts because, it's so important to who I am to be a good Democrat or Republican. That's not what I'm seeing amongst immigrants. That behavior is not what I'm seeing. They are, exactly as you're saying, behaving in local politics the same way as Democrats, right? Like immigrant Republicans in general, look like Democrats on these local issues. To some extent, there are still partisan gaps that I could show you. But they look more like Democrats on these local issues than they do on these national issues, that's not because they're aware of the national politics. It's not that they're saying, well, the Republican Party opposes densification, so I oppose densification. They oppose it for the same self-interested reasons as the Democrats, right? They don't need to know that the party that they support, they just end up in alignment because their self-interest is in alignment with their party, right? No one knows that the Republican Party supports or opposes densification because, again, the partisan cues actually aren't there at the national level. In some state legislatures, they're there. There's a chapter in the book about that, actually. But it's not so much. There really isn't this partisan cueing process. There's just like a lack of conflict because they happen to not face the conflict. I think, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
So I have questions about 3 of your assumptions, and one of them is one I think you just articulated, but I think it's something you also, it's a point that you made repeatedly during your talk, which is that Democrats favor densification, let's call it the YIMBY position, or abundance, it's been rebranded,
Yeah.
and Republicans don't.
Yeah.
But that's not true.
Yeah.
YIMBYism is bipartisan. There's a major housing bill moving through Congress now, and both Republicans and Democrats support it, and it's very YIMBY. Not as YIMBY as some of the YIMBYs would like, but YIMBY. That's one thing. Secondly, you also assume that densification is redistributive and left. That is the prevailing, that is, as I say, the hegemonic position in this country right now. It's the position of the planning profession. It's the position of the media, almost completely. It's the position of elected officials. However, it's a contested position, and I invite you to look at some recent research, a paper that was co-authored by a young assistant professor, Max Buchholz, and Michael Storper, and 2 other authors, scholars, which argues, that the problem is inequality, and that zoning, it's not that it doesn't have any effect, but in terms of questions of affordability and fairness and equity, it's minor compared to the questions of wealth, the wealth effect. And thirdly, maybe it's different in Massachusetts, but man, in California, the status quo is gone. There are hundreds of bills now. This is after 10 plus years of legislation led by, for example, Scott Wiener, who is would like very much and may very well succeed Pelosi in Congress, and my own, if you will, Assembly member Buffy Wicks, and former State Senator Nancy. These are the Wicks and Skinner represent this area right here. Skinner's termed out. Now it's Eric Gain, used to be mayor of Berkeley. It's over. It's history. It's done in California. And to talk about local control and low density is something that still persists, it's just not true.
Yeah, no, those are really, really important points. So I guess what I would say is I don't assume that these are democratic policies. I assume that these are redistributive policies. That's correct. And so I'm basing that assumption on the social science literature, which suggests that liberalizing zoning, to your point, like liberalizing zoning is not the solution to economic, racial inequality and justice. It's not the solution to climate change. But I think most of the social science scholarship would agree that liberalizing zoning will reduce, for example, spatial inequalities like I'm talking about here. So the assumption in the book is certainly not that these are democratic policies. And in fact, what I'm showing you in that chart there is exactly that they aren't democratic policies because the national parties are not divided on these issues. People don't think of these as Democratic or Republican because the parties aren't taking stances. Now, we could look at the 2024 presidential platforms and you will see like Kamala Harris had 1.5 pages dedicated to like a comprehensive densification plan, and Donald Trump had about a paragraph. But actually what I do in chapter 5 of the book is I try to look at what are the available cues on these messages to voters in their state and local context. And precisely as you say, we go through and we collect all of the state level housing preemption policies that have been passed in the last 8 years in legislatures across the country, and we measure the percentage of Democratic legislators and Republican legislators who have voted in favor of those preemption policies. And what we show is that the vast majority of state level preemption policies, which to your point, is exactly where the action is happening right now, is these state level preemption policies, which are overriding local control over zoning. Those policies are like well above average, passed by Democrats, not Republicans. So densification at the national level is not partisan coded. That's what I was showing you in that chart. At the state level, in the states that have passed preemption legislation, it is largely providing Democratic cues that densification is a Democratic measure. And then we also collected 600,000 tweets from the YIMBY movement. And we coded the frames that the YIMBY movement is using to make arguments in favor of maybe tweets that the Berkeley Abundance Group is doing, I don't know, that they're using across the country to make arguments in favor of zoning liberalization. What we find is that, exactly to your point, they largely are not making partisan arguments. So they're not making partisan arguments. The YIMBY movement is nonpartisan. It's formally nonpartisan, and substantively it's nonpartisan. But they are often making ideological arguments. And one of the main ideological arguments is about this redistributive aim of densification. So they're basically sort of mirroring the social science literature and saying that we know that densification can improve housing affordability for low-income Californians. And they tweet about this all the time. And so if you're like kind of the average voter living in one of those 20 largest MSAs that I showed you in the survey, that voter has access to two kinds of information about housing policy from their state and local context. One piece of that information is partisan information from their legislature, which probably tells them that Democrats support densification, and the other piece of information is probably information from their local YIMBY movement, which tells them that this is a redistributive issue, and that would lead us to expect that liberals would therefore support the redistributive issue. Then we use that information in a survey experiment. We provide that information to voters according to the states and localities in which they live. And we try to assess if telling suburban Democrats and Democratic homeowners that this is a partisan policy or like a policy that can have these redistributive consequences will lead them to support those policies more. And we find that it does. So I think all of that goes into support of the argument that I've shown you here, which is to say that these are not democratic policies. These are redistributive policies that have the potential, as I said, the potential. They are not on the ground at the moment, largely creating this conflict between self-interest and redistributive aims. But when we force that conflict by providing people information about the partisan or ideological sort of cues about these issues, they will change their opinions. That's part 3 of the book, which is potentially the most interesting part because it's the future, right? We kind of have like past, present, future. So I think those are actually like the key things. I think those are the central questions really that you're kind of raising here that are kind of like germinating in the politics.
You're just, and I won't speak again, but you just dismissed the challenges. It's not only the paper that Buchholz co-authored, it's also a paper, this is just earlier this year, it was written by 4 Federal Reserve economists. In fact, one of the authors, Storper, and Scholar Louie, one of the Federal Reserve economists, just gave a presentation at UCLA at the Luskin Summit. Now, I will say, there were 2 breakout sessions. Storper and Louie attacked the YIMBY position. The other breakout session were 2 UCLA, 2 of Storper's colleagues, Paolo Moncanon, and I think it was Michael Lenz. They're pro-YIMBY. But my point to you is, I think as a scholar, that you need to address, at least grapple with, the challenges that are being presented to this dominant discourse.
Yeah, I think the same is true with the deleveling policy I talk about in the book. And this is actually I think I've gotten a lot of similar feedback on that policy too, which is the sense that, with that policy, like there's been a lot more, I think, research on housing and zoning liberalization and the potentially redistributive effects of that. But when it comes to education, there's been a lot less research on the policy I talk about in this book. And some of the findings are actually mixed as to whether or not they achieve these redistributive aims, right? Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that that's definitely something that I'm working on and trying to figure out how it fits with the argument. And I think that where I've kind of landed is like this, that these have redistributive potentials, but most importantly, that they are passed with redistributive aims by the policymakers who pass them, and they make those arguments clear to their voters. And so when they have those arguments, do they change their behaviors? When they do make those arguments clear. I think you had a hand, and then we can go back, yeah.
So I guess like one question here is, should the AMP movement code? I guess the interesting thing here is, should the YIMBY movement code more of their messaging as, if you're a NIMBY, you're a Republican?
Yeah, so that was actually one of the things we were coding for in the YIMBY movement's tweets is like, are they associating NIMBYism with Republicanism? That was like our one part to label. They don't do it often, right? As I said, they're not doing it often. One of the interesting things we found in this experiment where we used existing YIMBY movement arguments and state policy cues is that, like I said, it did make people behave in more like pro-housing ways, express policy preferences that are more pro-housing. But it actually did it through like a partisan queuing process in both treatments. So one treatment is like, Democrats support this. So you would expect that then people would say, okay, I support this because I'm a Democrat. That's like the political science theory, right? And then the other treatment is a housing group supports this because it's good for low-income, working-class Californians. And you would expect people to support that, not because they think it's a Democratic policy, but because they support redistribution. They would support it for ideological reasons, not partisan reasons. That's what the YIMBY movement is trying to do. But then we had these sort of post-treatment additional questions to measure the mechanism of opinion change. And actually in both cases, for the YIMBY movement's affordability argument and like the Democratic partisan cue, in both cases, people changed their opinions not because they learned something ideological about redistribution, but because they were like, oh, Democrats support this issue. So they read that argument from the YIMBY movement and they said, oh, Democrats support this issue. It did not affect their belief in the redistributive nature of housing. So it's not persuading them, it's just cueing them, at least in this experiment. And I think there's a lot more work to be done there on that question. So to answer your question, my co-authors and I we have two amazing grad student co-authors on that chapter of the book, and it's a separate journal article. We were kind of writing this up in the discussion, like, what does this mean when we think about like messages that voters receive? And do they learn partisan messages from ideological arguments all the time? And if that's the case, then it wouldn't matter what the YIMBY movement does. I think so too. I think there's a lot more work to be done on that question.
So thanks so much for the talk. And certainly walking around Berkeley, when you see the immigrants are welcome here in front of the $2 million houses in North Berkeley, it raises this question sort of exactly, what does the here mean?
Yeah.
If it's sort of a national or local issue. But I just had a question about how you're operationalizing this definition of a suburb versus city.
Yeah.
So you're talking about suburban, but you're talking about the most affluent suburbs in the country, right?
Yeah.
This is not Vallejo or Dedham. These are like sort of the richest suburbs attached to the richest urban areas in the country. So I wonder how sort of representative they are of the American suburban experience, which obviously most Americans at this point live in some like a suburban area.
Yeah.
And then thinking about how you're coding city versus suburban.
Yeah.
So Philadelphia and Los Angeles look very different in terms of the percentage where you have zoned single family housing. So there's a geographic difference that makes it kind of difficult to map kind of city to suburban along this sort of upzoning kind of issue that I think is your primary motivation. I'm just wondering how you think about that.
No, they're really, I feel like you all are asking questions that are like central to this. So like very kind of the sort of technical answer to your question in the survey data, and actually in all of the quantitative analyses in the book, I defined suburbs as any municipality in an MSA, in a metropolitan statistical area that is not the largest city of that metropolitan statistical area. So like LA is a city, everything else in the Los Angeles, Long Beach metro area is a suburb. That means Long Beach is also coded as a suburb in those analyses. I can run it a different way, which would be to say every principal city of the MSA. So in that case, Long Beach and Los Angeles are also cities. They're both cities, and everything else is a suburb. Things look pretty similar in the survey data I could show you, depending on how you define it that way. And I match people based on their zip code, so where the center of your zip code is, like into which municipality. So that's like the technical definition. But what you're actually interested in, I think, is more of like how I'm thinking about suburbs. And I was talking about this with an urban sociology colleague of mine at BU a couple of weeks ago. And she was talking about this sort of argument about like the flattening of place. Like, is there really any difference between cities and suburbs anymore? Is Berkeley a city or is Berkeley a suburb? Is Oakland a city or is Oakland a suburb? Like, these are really, I think, important and salient questions. For me in the book, what matters is the municipal boundaries. because that's what gives you control over local policies. And that is sort of like historically, when we think about what gave rise to the suburbs in the first place, it was the combination of federal policies, but also local control over zoning and zoning and education. That's also particularly tricky though when we think about suburbs in the South. I don't know if any of you have read Matthew Laster's great book about Southern politics and segregation, but one of the key reasons for the debates that they were having about busing in many Southern school districts was that their school districts aren't municipal level, they're county level. And what led to a lot of the sort of differences between Northern and Southern sort of fights about busing and desegregation is a Supreme Court decision in the 1960s, which said you can't force metro-wide integration of school systems. So it reaffirmed local control, which helped all of the sort of non-Southern cities that have local school districts, not county-wide school districts. So for the most part, I think about that local control as really central to the dynamics I'm talking about here. And that's why I was kind of trying to highlight this residential sorting linked to housing and education policy preferences, because those are the two policy domains that throughout the country, local governments typically have control over. Like they might also have control over parks, but not every city has major parks, for example. And the big exception there is the South. So that's really how I think about suburbs, is they are distinct municipalities with control over those policy domains, but they are within the sort of same commuting zone and local economy as the central city. In my technical coding, yes, Oakland is a suburb. Yeah.
So Long Beach will also be a suburb. Santa Monica will be a suburb.
Yes. Yeah. Is Santa Monica a separate municipality though? Yeah. So yeah. In the survey coding, but I can do it a different way, and it would all kind of pretty much look the same. Like it all pretty much looks the same. So we can think about Long Beach and LA as both the city and everything else the suburbs. I do it this way because that's what some other political scientists have done, but another way that people do it is by suburbs as a distance from central cities, and that I don't do and won't do because of the whole municipal boundary thing. To me, the thing that is so important is that suburbs are municipalities. Oh, okay, then your other question was about heterogeneity across suburbs. So this I do in a new paper that I'm working on with a couple of co-authors, where we call it varieties of suburban politics, for all of you varieties of capitalism fans. We basically look at all the suburbs in the country. We do a clustering analysis to try to see different trajectories of political and economic change. And what we find is that these kinds of suburbs I'm talking about here are a very small numerically, in terms of all suburban places, but they're very large in terms of population. So precisely because these are the suburbs of the growing metro areas, right? So if you think about the percentage of Americans who live in suburbs, a good chunk live in knowledge economy suburbs, not quite as affluent as the ones I've shown you here, but a good chunk live in knowledge economy suburbs. There are many more suburbs that are not knowledge economy suburbs. They are the kinds of suburbs suburbs of Detroit or Cleveland, the ones I mentioned at the beginning. Demographers sort of think of those as the earliest suburbs and the most declining suburbs. When we talk about the growth of suburban poverty, we're often talking about those kinds of communities. There's definitely different stories of what's going on with suburban politics, and we try to get at that in this other paper, which I think is really important, but definitely different dynamics than what we're talking about here. Yes. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this talk. Lots to think about. Very, very interesting. I had kind of two questions. The first one's a little bit broad and perhaps vague, but it's coming from the very first question that was asked about, you know, what's surprising, what might be the puzzle here. And I'm thinking just, do you, going into this, kind of have a theory of political decision making when you're thinking about these interviewees, survey respondents as actors, right? It seems like on some level you're advocating for it's rational choice theory, it's self-interest, on the level of local politics, and on the level of national, it's affective polarization or it's ideology. And so I'm just curious about your kind of epistemological background, right? If you have a theory of political salience or what motivates political decision making.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I could pause for the second one if you.
Oh no, please go.
And then the second one, I'm curious about. You had brought up a little bit earlier in some of the kind of framing about the notion of down ballot voting, right? And it seems to me that this actually becomes quite important for thinking about like how these politics trickle down, so to speak, from nationalization to the state and then to the local level, right? And are you seeing things like partisan divergences in voting patterns among the people in these affluent suburbs where they're voting Democrat at the national level, but voting Republican on the local level? Or it's just that the Democratic candidates on the local level tend to have what we might consider like, divergent policy preferences. And so there's a filtering of partisan identity that's operating on different levels, right? Thinking like in the context of California, that like the debates that are happening on the national level in the 2024 election with, Harris's policies on housing are very, very different from the debates that are happening on the state level where things like property tax are being decided, right? And different from things that are happening on the local level. And they're all Democrats all the way down. So there are partisan cues, but they are just happening at different levels, perhaps with different ideological kind of, so I'm just thinking about down ballot voting and kind of partisan cues across scale.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think in my context, when I'm talking about down ballot voting, I'm actually talking about ballot measures, not local election, not local counselor, not candidates. Measures, not candidates. And so there actually aren't any partisan cues. I think there's been a lot of really great and recent work you're probably familiar with by Justin de Benedictis Kestner, one of my colleagues, and I feel bad that I just butchered his last name, but him and Chris Warshaw have done a lot of work showing that the election of partisan city councilors and mayors actually does matter for a lot of policy outcomes that we might have otherwise expected it not to matter for. So if we were then to take that down to the level of sort of voter behavior, we might think that people are actually voting for Democrats for city council because they want different policy outcomes. Like that's, and particularly look at things like government expenditures. They also look at housing supply. So they show that electing a Democratic city councilor increases housing supply. Over the next 3 years, I believe. They also show that it increases expenditures in a way we wouldn't expect city councilors to be able to do, but they do that by increasing their debt to local government. And so if we were to take that evidence, we might think that, I think your question is like, are people voting for Democrats at the local level for the same reason they vote for Democrats at the national level? Or are they voting over these other policy concerns? So I guess we don't know the answer to that question. Their evidence would suggest that perhaps they are trying to get some of these different policy outcomes because when they elect Democrats, they are getting different policy outcomes. So maybe. I think now you're asking about like my epistemology. So there's obviously like a big debate. Are people partisans or are they self-interested? And when they behave like partisans, are they behaving, as you just said, are they behaving like Democrats because they want Democratic policy outcomes? Or are they behaving like Democrats because they want their team to succeed and they're part of a team and so they want their team to succeed? I would say that I, based on my own research, I would fall like somewhere in the middle of that debate. And like I'm a sociologist, so when I talk about self-interest, I think self-interest is like emergent and situated in social contexts. And that's kind of what I'm trying to show you here, right? That like self-interest emerges over time as you become deeply embedded in a community and your way of thinking about what you want for your life changes like over the life course. You have kids and suddenly you don't want to live downtown anymore. You want to live in a suburb. You live in that suburb for 10 years and you really want to defend what you love about that suburb. And that's a sort of evolving way of thinking about self-interest that's kind of different from like a purely like, rational choice, maximizing utility kind of way of thinking about it. That's like an a priori assumption of preferences, whereas I think preferences emerge in context. Where do I think do I think people are, I don't know if I really should get into this, but do I think people are as affectively polarized as we sometimes think in the literature? No, I think that there's a lot of evidence that affective polarization can be experimentally, you can make people behave in less polarized ways just by telling them that to think about a Republican that they really respect, like Matthew Lewandowski has shown us. So I think that's probably not what's going on, but I do think that people are drawing on cues from everything that's going on around them. That's what I was trying to show you in that last piece of evidence, right? And oftentimes in national politics, those cues are partisan. So even then we could think that that's like a self-interest model, right? That it's cheaper to default to partisan heuristics. So in national politics, those cues are often partisan, but what I'm trying to argue here is that when it comes to local politics, the cues are often just from our community. And that's actually still like a social group, social identity theory about political behavior, because it's about other people like us telling me how I should behave, right? I'm drawing on those cues to think how I should behave. It's just not a partisan group at the local level. That's part of what I'm trying to show. Yes.
Hello.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry. No,
okay.
please.
I'm not a sociologist, but I happen to have this book in my bag about rural suburbs in California.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering
Oh my God, amazing.
if you think about rural suburbs, if you've considered rural suburbs, and how you're talking a lot about how space still means something. And I think rurality still means something, even in a state like California. And you're talking about how people take these cues from their community. A lot of times, these types of places are not so motivated by things like housing and education. This is by Paul J.P. Sandul.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I saw you looking at it.
Yeah, sorry.
A lot of the time and even like you said, they historically were not created by white flight, but by the agricultural, industrial economy. And agriculture plays such a strong role in that. Things like water rights play such a strong role in local politics there. And so I'm just wondering if you think about that or how you think about rural suburbs.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what you or this person means by rural suburbs, but I guess like, yeah, when I think about rural, at least in my work, it's a community that's kind of outside the economic zone of the central city. So for me, if it's that far outside, it wouldn't be a suburb. There is this kind of category of community that I'm very interested in. Actually, one of this co-author I was talking about working on this variety of suburban politics thing, he's very interested in this because he's really Michael Shepard, he's really a scholar of rural politics. These like suburbanizing rural areas, and maybe that's what this person's talking about, kind of like the kind of like on the edge of like major metro areas that are becoming more suburban that were really historically rural.
Well, in this book, he just means suburbs where their main economy is on agriculture.
Oh, is agriculture. Okay. I would say that's kind of like, it sort of falls into the category of what I was talking about before, like kind of definitely not the kinds of suburbs that we would generalize to from what I've shown you here. Even the survey data, which I've said is generalizable, that's from the 20 largest metro areas in the country. And so most of their suburbs are reasonably dense, and they actually are kind of, but what we show in this other varieties of suburban politics paper is that there's like 4 kinds of suburbs. There's this kind of suburb that I've shown you. There's another kind of suburb, and this all kind of emerged inductively from the clustering analysis from the data. So this wasn't me putting on like knowledge economy suburbs matter, it's just what came out of the data. And so like there's a knowledge economy cluster, we're calling it that. We call it an affluent cluster. And there's actually what we call like a diversifying cluster. So this is a cluster that's become like much more foreign born and much less white in the last 40 years, but not quite as affluent as the affluent cluster. Those 2 clusters, as I was saying before, they are the vast majority of America's suburbanites. And they have become much more democratic in the past 40 years. The other 2 clusters, which are the vast majority of America's suburbs, one is actually quite like a declining cluster. So I think about this cluster actually as communities that are much more similar to the post-industrial context I studied in my first book. Those are places that are suffering oftentimes from like a dual economic and demographic decline, right? Like the economy, the jobs dwindle, the young educated folks leave in search of better opportunity, and the population dwindles. One of my field sites in my first book had lost 20% of its population in 40 years. Like, just think about that. That's a lot. Because their biggest plant eventually had a fire and never reopened. So I think of those suburbs actually as more like the communities I studied in my first book than these communities. Those places have not turned to left at all. And then there's another cluster of suburbs that hasn't turned to left either, which is, we call them like replenishing, because they're not declining like this group. They're actually kind of seem to be repeating the same demographic pattern of like post-war suburbs. They're continuing to attract like young white middle class people. So they look sort of very similar, like they become whiter relative to some of the other groups as they've diversified. And they're also not becoming more democratic. So again, the way to think about it is like the vast majority of suburbanites are living in places that are becoming more democratic. The vast majority of suburbs are not. But this is making me think that this paper has legs. So, and it's got some cool math. I think there's someone behind you actually who's had her hand, or did you?
She said, never mind.
If you're looking for research on de-leveling, and what an interesting case, go about 4 years back.
Yeah.
San Francisco tried to de-level.
Yes. Yes, this actually comes up a lot.
Will tell you, people stick to their guns and they appear from everywhere and never get these moms angry. Politics.
Well, as someone who has an 8-month-old baby and so is now a mom for the first time, I can tell you, I could get angry about my baby. I could get really angry. I don't know over what, but I could get angry. Yeah. So one last question, I think.
That was just a quick question too. So you mentioned that one category that's replenishing suburb,
Yeah.
right? I think they're in like California too, like Yorba Linda and Redlands and parts of those places. You're saying they're not become. Can you just explain why they're like not becoming more democratic?
Yeah. So
It's really interesting.
Yorba Linda is actually one of my cases for this book. It's that like chapter 6 case. So I actually know Yorba Linda very well. Yorba Linda would, in our clustering analysis, would pop up as an outlier case because it is one of the actually affluent suburbs. Like Yorba Linda has become very, very affluent and increasingly racially heterogeneous and highly educated, but it hasn't turned to the left as much. It's still quite Republican relative to other suburbs of that class. So based on what we can tell from the data so far, the two like core demographic predictors of a turn to the left in these clusters are an increase in immigration and an increase in education rates. So the places that are increasingly highly educated and immigrant and more foreign-born residents are turning more to the left. And it seems to be not driven, but like related to policy attitudes that are socially liberal, not fiscally liberal. So there actually aren't a lot of differences in fiscal policy opinions across actually geography, period, in America, according to CCS data, but there's a lot of social policy differences. And sort of those replenishing suburbs and the declining suburbs are much more socially conservative on things like gun control, abortion, and racial equality. So I think that's like, I feel like I explained my entire body of research to you all today. Sorry.
Thank you so much. We are at time. Please join me in thanking Stephanie one more time.